This is the 3 Arts Workshop, week 7, and this week in Rhetoric, we're looking at schemes. What is a scheme? Last week we talked about the first of the 2 basic divisions of figures of speech, the trope. This week we're talking about schemes. A scheme is an extraordinary use of word order for rhetorical effect. Whereas the trope was an extraordinary use of word meaning, a scheme is an extraordinary use of word order. Let me show you an example. Remember this famous line from Kurtz in Heart of Darkness, "The horror, the horror." It's a scheme. Why? Because repetition is a scheme. In our ordinary speech, we don't repeat words, but if we do repeat words, it indicates some kind of heightened meaning, some heightened, perhaps unconscious, rhetorical meaning. This is an example of a scheme. We're going to look at 5 different schemes this week: anadiplosis, anaphora, a syndeton, chiasmus, and a panalepsis. Figures of speech, schemes, they all have these juicy names. So let's take them one by one. Anadiplosis. That's the repetition of the last word of a clause at the beginning of the next clause. And a great example of this is from none other than Yoda, The Empire Strikes Back. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. This kind of daisy chaining act of rhetoric is called anadiplosis. It's where you have that last word of a clause beginning the next, and then sometimes the next movement and next succession works the same way. Last word of the clause starts the next. That's anadiplosis. Anaphora is the repetition of the beginning of a clause. Think of Alfred Lord Tennyson. "Now is done thy long day's work. Fold thy palms across thy breast. Fold thine arms, turn to thy rest." So anywhere you have the repetition of the word at the beginnings of clauses, you have anaphora. I have a dream that. I have a dream that. Martin Luther King. These are examples of anaphora. A syndeton. A series of things with no conjunctions. F. Scott Fitzgerald. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. Now, look at what normally would have happened in this sentence. I was a guide, a pathfinder, and an original settler. We would have normally put an "and" between the ultimate and penultimate items in the sentence. But here we don't. We omit it. We omit conjunctions. That's called a syndeton. A, like that root for without, the joinings of things. Chiasmus, a repetition in reverse order. This can be one of 2 types. We'll look at one kind of type. JFK, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So with this "can do" here in both clauses, we reverse the order of country and you. Country and you in the first clause becomes you and country in the last. This is a literal repetition of words. Sometimes we just have basic concepts reversed, or parts of speech. And I'll show you an example of this in the problems exercises we have at the end of this video. You'll catch it, though. It's this very noticeable grammatical reversal that happens. Certain categories or concept types are reversed from one clause to the next. A panalepsis, placing the same word at the beginning and end of a clause. A clause begins and ends with the same word. So example of this, Fulk Grayville, reason is now grown a disease of reason. There you have reason at the beginning and reason at the very end. Another common phrase, boys will be boys. Boys will be boys is another example of epanelepsis. Okay, so just like last week, we want to identify which of the schemes a given text represents. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is an example of anadiplosis, because I'm linking word with word there. The last item in the first clause becomes the first item in the second clause. Anadiplosis. Julius Caesar, I came, I saw, I conquered. An example of, you guessed it, a syndeton. I came, I saw, and I conquered might be what we normally say, or I came and I saw and I conquered. But here we've omitted all those conjunctions. This is a syndeton. Sir Philip Sidney, fly, fly, my friends. I have my death wound. Fly. Can you guess what this one is? Epanelepsis, right, because you have fly at the beginning, and actually fly for the second word, but fly at the beginning and fly at the end. Never mind Sidney's crazy Elizabethan spelling inconsistency. He's allowed to do that. He's a genius. Okay. Alexander Pope. His time a moment, and a point his space. You tell what this one is. This is chiasmus. As you see there, his time a moment, and a point his space. You see that time and space are linked as words denoting circumstance, and then moment and point are linked by this idea of the infinitesimal, right? The small, like smallness in time, and then point being smallness in space. But from the first part of this line to the second part of this line, you get a reversal, right? So it goes category of circumstance, then category of infinitesimal, and then category of infinitesimal, and then category of circumstance. There's a reversal there. So unlike the last example, this is chiasmus, not with the actual repetition of words, but with the repetition of sort of placeholder concepts. And if all fails, you can just feel chiasmus, I think, at a rather intuitive level when you see how perhaps the second clause or the second half of a line is switching up some thing in the sentence. There's some sort of feel of switchery going on. That's chiasmus. From Spencer, sweet is the rose, but grows upon a briar. Sweet is the juniper, but sharp his bough. Sweet is the eglantine, but pricketh near. What is this? Well, the most obvious thing in this passage is the repetition of sweet, sweet, sweet at the beginnings of these lines. That's right. It's an aphora. An aphora, the repetition of the beginning of a line. So sum it all up, anadiplosis, the repetition of the last word of a clause at the beginning of the next. An aphora, the repetition of the beginning of a clause. A syndeton, a series of things with no conjunctions. Chiasmus, a repetition in reverse order. And epanelepsis, placing the same word at the beginning and end of a clause. So be ready to identify these guys in our next quiz.